This is the lecture for Chapter 19, Disorders of the Immune System, Part 2. From the previous lecture, I told you that the disorders of the immune system are divided into two basic types. The first one is an overreaction or a hypersensitivity. The second one is an underreaction or a loss of immunity. For the hypersensitivities, last time I talked about those, specifically allergy. An allergy is when your body has an immune response to a foreign molecule that is non-pathogenic. And because it's non-pathogenic, not dangerous, this is an overreaction. And the allergy is divided into four types. Type 1, which is anaphylaxis. Type 2, which is cytotoxic. Type 3, which is immune complex. And type 4, which is cell-mediated. So those are the basic four types of hypersensitivity when you're talking mainly about allergy. And the first three have to do with antibodies, and the last one has to do with the T cells. In this lecture, I'm going to focus on a different type of hypersensitivity, and that is autoimmunity. Autoimmunity is where your immune system is responding to a self-antigen. So a self-antigen is a molecule that is a normal part of your body and your immune system is responding to it. So autoimmunity, this is a disorder of the immune system because your immune system should be tolerant to all of your self molecules. So when a person develops an autoimmune disorder, they are experiencing a loss of self-tolerance. The exact cause of autoimmune disorders is not known, but one hypothesis on how they can be triggered to develop is called molecular mimicry. And the idea behind molecular mimicry is that an individual becomes infected with a microbe. Then that individual mounts an immune response to that microbe, so either producing CTLs and or antibodies against a particular antigen on that microbe. But then what happens is that that antigen is very similar in shape and structure to a normal self molecule. So the antigen that is found on the microbe is very similar in shape to a self molecule. So that when the infection is cleared, once all of these antibodies and CTLs have cleared the microbe from the body, then those remaining antibodies now start binding to the self molecules that are similar in shape to that antigen. So it's basically a cross reaction. So the idea behind molecular mimicry is that the microbe has antigens on it that are similar to self-antigens, and when the infection is gone, those immune components that recognize the foreign antigen will now recognize the self-antigen. So that is the hypothesis that they're using right now, investigating right now, that can trigger an autoimmune disorder. There are some predisposing factors to developing an autoimmune disorder. The main one is being female. So something about a female's immune system makes women much more likely to develop an autoimmune disorder. And there is also a genetic component. Autoimmune disorders tend to run in families. There are many different types of autoimmune diseases, and they can be loosely classified into several different groups. The first type of autoimmune disease I want to talk about are cytotoxic autoimmune diseases. Cytotoxic implies that it's killing cells, but for these types of autoimmune disorders, the cells are not killed, but their function is altered. Myasthenia gravis is a type of cytotoxic autoimmune disease. And in myasthenia gravis, there are antibodies which block the stimulation of muscle cells. And so that results in a type of paralysis. Under a normal situation, you have the neuromuscular junction. So here is the neuron, here is the muscle cell, and you know that the neuron will release acetylcholine to bind to receptors on the muscle cell and stimulate a contraction. In myasthenia gravis, there are antibodies that bind to the acetylcholine receptors and prevent the acetylcholine from stimulating the muscle cell. So that inhibits contraction of the muscles and leads to paralysis. So in this case, the antibodies are preventing the muscle cell from contracting. But they're not killing the muscle cell, they're not killing the neuron, they're just preventing the muscle cell from contracting. Graves' disease is another example of a cytotoxic autoimmune disease. And in this case, the antibodies are stimulating cells to overproduce thyroid hormones. So this occurs in the thyroid, and the antibodies bind to the receptors on the thyroid cells, overstimulating the cells so that they produce excess thyroid hormones. So Graves' disease is a type of hyperthyroidism. And again, the antibodies are not killing the cells, they're just overstimulating the cells to produce more hormone than they normally should. And some symptoms of Graves' disease are bulging eyes, so you can see that in some of the individuals who have it. And also, if it's untreated Graves' disease, you would see a goiter, so where the thyroid would swell. Another type of autoimmune disorder are immune complex autoimmune diseases. Immune complex autoimmune disorders occur when antibodies bind to soluble antigen. So the antibodies will bind to the soluble antigen, and one of the results of antibody binding to antigen is agglutination, which forms these complexes of antibody and antigen. And these complexes are big enough to get stuck in basement membranes or in capillaries where they can damage the tissues, damage the capillaries, and lead to inflammation. Lupus is an example of an autoimmune disorder, and in individuals who have lupus, they are producing antibodies against nuclear proteins. So those antibodies circulate throughout the circulatory system, and they bind to various nuclear proteins and forming those complexes, which can get cut in the skin, causing rashes. They can get caught in the brain, altering the function of the brain, get caught in the lungs, causing inflammation, also causing inflammation in the spleen. They can get in the joints, causing arthritis, and again in the kidneys, damaging the kidneys. And kidney damage is a hallmark of untreated lupus. One of the classic signs of lupus is the butterfly rash. So that's a rash that goes across the nose, over the cheeks, and forms sort of a butterfly shape. And that is caused by those immune complexes, those antibody-antigen complexes getting lodged in the capillaries in the skin. Another immune complex autoimmune disorder is rheumatoid arthritis, and this is where antibodies are produced that recognize molecules in the joints. So those immune complexes are formed in the joints, where they cause a chronic inflammation in the joints, which leads to damage in the joints. And this is an autoimmune disorder, so children can develop this. There is juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. It has nothing to do with overuse of joints. It's an autoimmune disorder. The last general group of autoimmune disorders are cell-mediated autoimmune diseases, and this involves the T cells damaging tissues in the person's body. Type 1 diabetes is an example of a cell-mediated immune disorder. And for this type of condition, this affects the pancreas. The pancreas, of course, is the organ that produces insulin, And this is what a normal islet would look like with the normal beta cells that are producing insulin. In type 1 diabetes, CTLs are activated against the beta cells, and they destroy the beta cells in the islets, which reduces the production of insulin. So sometimes this is also known as insulin-dependent diabetes because we have to artificially provide the insulin since the beta cells are being actively killed off by CTLs. Another example of a cell-mediated autoimmune disorder is multiple sclerosis. In multiple sclerosis, you have antibodies and CTLs that are attacking the myelin sheath along the axons of neurons. And this destroys the myelin sheath, which leads to an inhibition of nerve impulses to the brain, which results in a loss of control of the muscles of the body.